It's the Pittsburgh Golf Now Par 4. Matt Gajtka and Zac Weiss along with you. Thank you for joining us once again as we haven't come to the end of the calendar year, but we've essentially come to the end of the elite golf season. In the matter of a couple of weeks, we had the Solheim Cup, we had LIV Chicago, and of course, we had the 2023 Ryder Cup in Rome, Italy. Yes, golf will continue on, including the PGA Tour and LIV and some elite women's play as well. But as far as the major events are concerned, I think we can safely put a wrap on the season. Now, Zac, as we talk about the Ryder Cup here, the U.S. dropping a decision on the road in Europe, if you will, on the road, I guess, kind of a funny way to put it, but on foreign soil, that's what we've been saying very much so over the course of the past 3 decades plus now that they have not been able to get it done in Europe. And a lot of times it's just not even really that close. And I guess that was the main issue for me. I think it was going to be a tough sell to get people to tune in regardless because of how early it was starting with the time difference in Italy, coverage beginning at 1:30 in the morning in the Eastern time zone, even worse out west. And also the fact the Americans fell behind 4-0 on the opening alternate shot session and really didn't get it any closer than that the rest of the way. So I realize Sunday singles are always at least a little bit interesting because 12 of the 28 points are up for grabs then. But I find it hard to believe that most golf fans would think that this one was some sort of a sensational event. We've had a lot of blowouts lately, too, in favor of the home teams in the Ryder Cup. So for me, just the time difference was one thing, but also just the troubling trend that we're not really seeing that down-to-the-wire action that we saw a lot in the 1990s and in the early portion of the 2000s. And also we saw some pretty decent action in 2010. But ever since then, we have not been privy to a Sunday that really decided things and that you had to hang on all the way to the bitter end. So what are your takeaways from the actual golf portion of the Ryder Cup? Because we have a lot of stuff to get to that's not related to hitting shots that we'll just tackle in shot number 2.
I actually played golf.
You did, yes. From what I missed a lot of it while I was asleep, though.
It just felt like sensationalism, but no, seriously, it was the inverse of the Solheim Cup, right? Where Solheim Cup, the Americans led 4-0 after the first session. Then, of course, the inverse happened, as you mentioned earlier. Just the Americans just weren't sharp when it mattered. And when you have a European side that's so informed, that's been getting the reps these last few weeks, whereas the Americans have been resting, recovering, processing, grinding up for the next season, whatever the case may be. This is just a comedy of just errors, you know? I mean, it happens. It's tough to win when you're the road team. I mean, ask any team in any professional sports or collegiate sports franchise. It's just a difficult thing to do. It's a tough task. And, you know, we're the right couple of captains picks outside of JT picked. I don't know, maybe not necessarily. I mean, maybe you go with a LIV guy, hindsight being 2020. I think that's something we'll also possibly tackle later on as well. But I think that the European captains picks all had a purpose. Even you have the younger guys that really had opportunities. You had a guy like Rory McIlroy who admits that maybe he's on the back nine of his Ryder Cup time. So it's not like it's sight unforeseen. And everybody in the European side scored. They did something positive, and the Americans, I mean, we touched on it. You and I had a private. We'll kind of unload the curtain here. There was a Stephen Ames moment in the Ryder Cup, pretty much, which that obviously can only mean one thing: 9-8, and it was worse. It was 9-7. Well, it's just horrible that you have the guy that's so acclaimed as the top golfer in the entire world that just was flat. And you can blame a variety of things on it, which will be shot too, but just the Americans just did not have their best game, and the margin for error when they travel was thin, or were they jet lagged? We don't know, but just they saw the course just as much as the European team did coming in, so it's not like Europeans had that kind of an advantage either. They just flat out performed better, and you know, Victor Hovland was obviously a significant standout. Obviously, he flinched once on Saturday, but just so decisive, no hangover from winning that FedEx Cup. If I look at the American team, I think Justin Thomas was a hero in a lot of respects. Jordan Spieth was probably one of the biggest goats. Just didn't have anything, whether it was play, whether it was becoming a father for their second time just didn't have the oomph, didn't have the juice. Ricky Fowler just looked like he was under the weather the whole time, so that obviously was costly. Max Homa, though, I really think really is the guy that should be talked about for the American team, regardless of score. He got the team going. He's the highest point getter of all of the Americans. Just something to say about the fact that when it's a big moment, Max Homa is able to shine through. He showed that at the President's Cup last year, right? So there's a lot to be said that Homa is built for this stage. He's unafraid of the moment. And same thing with Justin Thomas. There was a lot of much to do about ultimately nothing. I mean, the guy had some good form. His friend just wasn't playing well. So, I mean, it happens. And for him to put a point on the board on Sunday, him being Justin Thomas, that's huge. So, I mean, there were some bright moments. And, I think when they saw that how few points they had by their side after 3 sessions, I mean, if that doesn't wake you up, then I don't know what does. So I think the sense of urgency that the Americans showed after was stellar. And I think the Europeans were intimidated to see so many American flags early on in the single stage, but it was just way too little too late. Just the Americans just didn't get out of the starting line good. And then if you're in a marathon and you're 5 miles behind the leader, you're not going to catch them. So it is what it is, and they just didn't load it properly, whether it was pairings, the stuff that we'll talk about in the second shot, or just flat out not playing well. It just wasn't their weekend. And look, it happens. It is what it is. But the fact that it's easier to talk about the second shot than the first shot might outline really why this Ryder Cup went the way that it did, Matt.
I do want to talk a little bit more about the golf, or at least trying to win this thing. But yeah, there are some juicy topics upcoming here in the second shot. So the U.S. loses by 5, and I believe that is the second closest margin that we've had in this thing since the Miracle at Medina in 2012. I misspoke earlier. 2010 was a close Ryder Cup, but 2012 was the closest one, the one that went down to the final match, essentially, maybe the final 2 matches actually out on the course. And so we had a couple of back-to-back competitive Ryder Cups, but now it's 5 in a row where the home team has pretty much dominated. I know there's always a couple of moments here or there. There's only 28 total points, so it's not going to be the incredible blowout margin that you might think we're talking about when we say it's not close. But I would say 4 points or more is not that close of a Ryder Cup in the end. And, of course, we had the historic American triumph at Whistling Straits 2 years ago where they won by 10. That is definitely beyond the pale when you hold a team under 10 points. That's happened a couple of times this century, once to the Americans, once to the Europeans. That's not good for business, not good for viewership, even if, say, most of America can watch it on a reasonable sleeping schedule like you could last time around. But a couple of things going against the Ryder Cup, at least in terms of American viewership this time around. But it is important to remember that there are plenty of Ryder Cup fans in Europe. In fact, you could argue the most passionate Ryder Cup fans are probably in Europe, considering what the championship, what the tournament, what the event has meant to their tour, now called the DP World Tour. The DP World Tour actually puts it on from the European side of things, which makes it different from here in America, where the PGA of America, not the PGA Tour, is the governing body, so to speak, of our side of the Ryder Cup. But is the Ryder Cup in need of resuscitation, in need of a solution? I saw a columnist, Shane Ryan of Golf Digest, say the Ryder Cup is broken. I'm not sure I'd go quite that far, but I do understand what he's talking about. We need to have a close finish here eventually. And it's weird considering I would say the two teams are closer than ever, but somehow that has translated to home advantage being more pronounced than it ever was, in my opinion. And so we've had suddenly a lack of drama at the back end of some of these Sunday singles sessions, which I think we can agree is not great for golf. So are there any tweaks you would make to the actual golf, to the format, to the way it's done? Do you think neutral site is a possibility? I'm not a big fan of that. I feel like home and away is a big part of the fun of the Ryder Cup. So I wouldn't necessarily change that, but I am open to changes to see if perhaps we can get this thing to be a little more down to the wire as opposed to how it has been lately.
I mean, I would start with the captain has to make all 12 selections. There's no,
like that, yeah.
What have you done? I want the most in-tune guys that are going to play the best golf and the most compelling golf. I don't want a boys club, which is what essentially the American side has been in recent iterations, for better or for worse. And I want to see a course that isn't just necessarily tailored towards home course advantage. It's a course that both teams have a legitimate chance at. And both teams, I mean, I think that Marco Simone played relatively fairly, all things considered. It wasn't as much of an advantage as previous courses, but I mean, there's still a little bit of a wrinkle there, right? I mean, these teams pick courses to either get a presumably guy. I'm sure they were figuring Francesco Molinari was going to be on this European team that just hasn't had form, and really that's what it boils down to. It's hard to predict these things for 4, 6, 8 years out. That's what happens when you have it every other year, but you have the tradition that is the President's Cup, an iteration where the players do get paid, by the way, hashtag shot too. But regardless of that, there's a lot of things to be said about just freshening things up and not just making it the status quo. They've changed 6 here, 3 there, 3 there, 4 here, 5 here, 3 there. They've changed how they're going to make picks. I just say screw it. I mean, you don't know what the landscape of golf is going to be in 2 years' time. I mean, I think a lot of guys that didn't make the team that are now on LIV both ways. I think, the format was maybe a little bit less, very disadvantageous for them, and they didn't get shots. Now, of course, they knew what they were doing when they signed on the dotted line and took the paycheck, but for guys like DeChambeau or guys like DJ to presumably either get or not get calls, regardless, I mean, Joaquin Neiman, same thing. Sergio, I mean, of course, he had a hullabaloo about everything, but Mito Pereira, you have guys like that maybe did not get calls, or if they did, they were kind of respectful, dutiful calls, not I'm calling you because, hey, we've connected in the past and it's just not going to be a fit this time. Heck, if it, make it even more, make a Price is Right wheel and just here's 20 guys that we're considering. We'll spin a wheel that lands on it. There's your team. Or you can do it that way for matches where it's not you're bouncing off each other. It's a random draw. And maybe you're playing foursomes, maybe you're playing four balls, but you don't know who your partner is. And that's where the team play aspect really comes into play, where I have to know this guy and his strengths and weaknesses. And maybe he's not a guy that's suited for my game, but I have to make him suited for my game and put my pride aside to get a point for my team. Some kind of something to make it interesting. I think 12 captains picks is very fair. You have all the 2 years to look at everything, have all the logistics and see everything, especially now in a landscape where the elevated designated events are even more paramount than they've ever been. I think they're putting the right emphasis on that. And I want a captain that's a little bit more relatable. I think that Zach Johnson, frankly, was a little bit of a miss. I just don't think he was the right captain for this group. I think he was great from a teamwork, but I think his pairings choices in the first day specifically cost his team a win. It became plain as day. Just they've had all this time to crunch the numbers and do all this research, and quite simply, it's easy to critique a captain when they don't do well. Roger Carrington, very guilty of that a couple of years ago, but just Zach Johnson, steely guy, but he's not going to blow you off the page or anything like that. It's going to be interesting down the line as you go through the iterations. It doesn't seem like Fred Couples has ever been a big Ryder Cup captain consideration. And, there's some of these LIV guys like Phil, like DJ, that aren't going to be really captain archetypes anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see what changes they make to keep this fresh. I think the players have one very easily in mind, but I don't think the fans are going to care about whether they get paid or not. But regardless of that, there's definitely changes they can and that they need to make to just make this fresh and make people care again, especially if the game's on, especially if first ball is at 1:30 in the morning on whatever time zone you're on.
Yeah, let's move on to the second shot from there. A natural segue, as you did bring up the pay for play. We've been talking about this since we were kids, Zach, with Mark O'Mara and David Duval bringing it up prior to the 1999 Ryder Cup at Brookline and saying that they should be paid. And as of right now, players are given money to make donations to the charity of their choice. So they're not going home totally empty-handed. And of course, you could say the prestige of playing in the Ryder Cup is definitely something, but it is weird that the Ryder Cup essentially prints money. It's a very popular event, and the guys who are out there actually doing the entertaining, doing the playing, putting themselves on the line are not getting anything monetarily from it that goes to their bank account. So that seems like a very relevant talking point for me. But we also had, of course, well, I guess it's tied into that. The whole Patrick Cantlay, is he not wearing a hat because he's disgruntled about not getting paid, or is he just not wearing a hat because it doesn't fit him, or he doesn't want to have a a hat tan for his wedding, which apparently was the day after the end of the Ryder Cup in Italy, which we found out on Sunday. Regardless, that led to the situation with Rory McIlroy and Cantlay's caddy Joe LaCava on the 18th green at the final hole of Saturday's 4-ball session. That turned into something with Rory not able to let that one go, and maybe there are still some tensions boiling under the surface. Of course, you had the usual, are the fans going a little too far, with whether it be the heckling of Cantlay or just in general. I think the Marshals essentially gave up at the end of the Ryder Cup and let everyone go where they wanted to go. But again, U.S. crowds have been rowdy, just trying to play both sides there. Let you know that I do realize that there's misbehavior on both sides of things. Then there's also, Xander Schauffele's dad, Stefan, negotiating with the PGA of America, getting Netflix cameras kicked out of the USA team room because he doesn't like the contract that doesn't give the players any compensation for that. So, boy, where do we go? Because I guess which one of those off the course, even though one was actually on the course, or a couple were actually on the course, but which of these non-golf related storylines from the Ryder Cup sticks with you and which might have some more staying power for you?
I mean, they all do, but I mean, we're going to make like Kanye West right here, Matt. We're going to play the blame game. I mean, let's just face it. That's what it's going to be. And it starts with Fred Couples. Honestly, from the beginning, when Fred Couples said on his podcast that Cameron Young was going to get a captain's pick. And unless Manti Te'o's girlfriend's name is Cameron Young, then I did not see him on that squad. Then he opens up his big mouth again and says, okay, Jordan Spieth, you're playing 4 times this week. Well, he sits the first session, and then he plays like absolute dog feces in the second session. So, I mean, there's pride, there's togetherness, but you have to separate pride from bravado. And when you put an excuse out through the water after you get shellacked in day one, with Zach Johnson offering the lame sauce excuse, oh, we were sick. Who cares? You got your butts handed to you on a silver platter. You literally gave them room service. You knocked on the European store. You said housekeeping. You gave them all the supplies they needed, and then you just walked away. I mean, it was a total back up the truck right over the dead body. It was horrible. So, I mean, you start there. I mean, Stefan, obviously, Schauffele is a very strong personality. It's an unconventional pairing, right, with the father also being the agent, but that's how it's always been. I had the encounter of meeting Stefan at Firestone and told him who I was and said that I was media. And I said, oh, you want to interview Xander? That's my son. I'm Stefan. I'm his dad. And you could just tell that he was running things, and that when Stefan introduced me to Xander, it was, oh, Xander, this is Zach. Zach wants to talk to you about this, that, the other. And away we went. So it was very clear that those two are very simpatico. And Xander and Patrick have been very buddy throughout the entire PGA Tour time, and they've both had the very same mindset. They had the mindset, allegedly, according to Stefan, about the Netflix cameras. They had the same mindset about pay for play. And, I mean, the President's Cup pays for play, which is something I mentioned earlier, so it's interesting. In addition to the charitable donation, of course, a lot of money goes to the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, which is especially huge for them. And for the PGA Tour, it helps out a lot of these players' pensions, which there is something to be said about that. That's something that Todd Lewis told the Golf Channel the day after the Ryder Cup as well, here on the Golf Channel, of course. So there's a lot to be said for the fact that there is some give back, but the players aren't seeing it. And one of the consequences of the LIV movement is players having the what's in it for me mentality. And when there is monotony and things aren't going well and you don't see money, I mean, heck, the Super Bowl halftime showed that performers don't make money. I don't know how much money the Olympic performers make, but at this point, the Ryder Cup was one of those stalwarts that players are doing it for the pride of their country. And that's gone. It's gone, at least from the American side. I'm sure some Europeans silently agree with that idea, but on the surface, I mean, we've talked about LIV talks all the time. Schauffele's been linked before. Cantlay's been linked before. So, I mean, maybe this is something that could be a straw that breaks a camel's back as they maybe make a decision as more of this framework between the PGA Tour, the PIF, and the everything else kind of, and the DP World Tour kind of rear its head and they come up with some framework, or they don't. But just that was controversial. I think Netflix not being in the room for the sanctimony of the Ryder Cup was the right call. but it took the players to come together to make that decision, as it did with the hats. I think that Joe LaCava was frustrated, but your role is as a caddy, and you're almost like Ralph Ellison, right? You're almost the invisible man, and no one looks at you unless you do something wrong. And he did something wrong, and by golly, Rory wasn't innocent in this either. I mean, there was a much better way to handle this, but I think in a sense he knew what he was doing. And Jamie Weir releasing a salacious story, potentially a hit piece that really wasn't anything there. I mean, Cantlay had a wedding. He didn't want a tan line. He didn't want hat hair. I mean, it is what it is. Call a spade a spade. It just seemed like a classic hit piece, really, just a ratchet job, to be quite honest. And it really set the Europeans off to finish the job. And I think for Joe LaCava, I think when time will heal the wound, I think when he has some time to just settle down and realize that the crowd in the moment got the better of him, it is what it is. But when you're beat up so much and your guy finally makes a really meaningful putt on the most important hole on the golf course, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that either. It'd be interesting to see what Tiger and Joey's conversation would be like. I will be honest, that would be interesting to see what Tiger would say, especially with Tiger being best friends with Rory, among other golfers as well. So that's interesting as well. But I think given that kinship, I think that time will forgive. I think that just Rory did exactly what he needed to do. You know, blow it a little bit, maybe a little past the line, and then just use it as motivation. Let the team use it as motivation. And the team saw that it ticked him off, so it ticked them off too, and it took after him. As the guy on the back nine of his Ryder Cup career, he's one of the leaders on the team. It doesn't have to be said. It's just understood. So really that's what it is. In terms of what's the biggest one, I mean, Fred Couples wasn't the biggest one by any stretch, but I think Fred Couples is the answer to the question because I think it started the domino effect of the bravado, the excuse making, and just everything that went. So I'm really going to go off the board because, again, even though it was a pebble in this rock, in this big rock in the stream, it's the pebble that kind of got everything going, where a lot of these grumbles, a lot of these bravados, a lot of these promises were made and just frankly just not delivered.
Right. I hear what you're saying because the entire Zach Johnson captaincy just seemed disheveled. I was never impressed with his appearances in front of the media, whether it be an official press conference or a flash interview after a tournament he played in. He just never seemed to have the thorough answer I was looking for. He essentially admitted he wasn't even looking at LIV players, which for me, if you're trying to take the best team, don't you want the best players playing the best right now? That just seems logical to me. But apparently for him, loyalties to the PGA Tour were more important than that. It just came off as lazy. Like you say, the couples, I don't even call them leaks. He just blabbed basically what he thought was happening, and it wasn't actually happening, didn't come to pass. The fact that the unveiling of the teams, it was a very low rent Zoom call look to the USA, whereas Team Europe had a full-fledged production on Sky Sports. It was, I guess you just, all those little things do add up to tell you maybe how seriously or how completely one side is considering and preparing for this event, and maybe one other side feels like, well, we can just get by on the bare minimum in some areas and still go out there and win this thing. So I'm not sure if those intangibles add up to a 5-point spread, but maybe it adds up to a half point or 1 point, or maybe it just sets a tone in the room and it doesn't allow guys to perform at their best, or the guys who would have performed at their best weren't even in the building. So there you go. We'll look forward to Bethpage. Of course, if the U.S. wins there, then it'll just be a continuation of the trend. Really, we're looking forward to Adair Manor in 2027 because that'll be the next time for the U.S. team to try to prove something and prove that they can do something that hasn't been done since 1990 or 1991, pardon me, or 93. I forget now at this point. Yeah, 93. Sorry, it's 30 years. It'll be 34 by the next time they get another shot at winning in Europe. Okay, well, we already discussed maybe that framework agreement between LIV and the various world tours doesn't go through. Perhaps if that happens, then there are more defections. I think that ties nicely into our third shot here. I was live in Chicago for a couple of days, for Saturday and Sunday, a couple of weekends ago, to cover the LIV event there for a second consecutive year. Couldn't get a straight answer, Zach, whether they're going back to Chicago. It seems like LIV is aiming further south in America for 2024. And yes, that schedule is supposedly coming out. I was tipped off to that at the event, and then Bob Herrig reported it full-fledged on ESPN.com a little bit later than that, or probably on SI.com. But Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Looks like another event in Oklahoma. Looks like another event in Florida. Doesn't leave a lot for the Midwest and the Northeast, which I kind of thought was LIV's strategy to hit some of those bigger cities that don't have a regular PGA Tour event. The crowds were a bit lighter in Chicago this time around for LIV. I think because the market was a little bit tapped out because of the BMW Championship at Olympia Fields just down the road in Greater Chicago, part of the PGA Tour's FedEx Cup playoffs this season. That's not going to happen every year, but for this year, it was definitely competition for LIV. But LIV continues to, well, at least strive for a third year and strive for more. And it looks like it's trying to angle itself more as the World Tour year over year, Zach, as we're hearing they're going to have 8 tournaments overseas compared to 6 in the U.S. At least that was the number in Bob Herring's report. They're going to go back to Southeast Asia. They're going to go back to Australia. They're going to go to South Korea for the first time. So, so much of this is in the air. It's so hard to analyze what's the future of LIV because it could be the future of the PGA Tour and the DP World Tour as well. So, when you talk about the future of LIV, for me being there in person, the on-course presentation remains compelling to me. I think it's a totally different product than what you get on the PGA Tour, LPGA, or USGA's major events. It's just, can they continue to get enough people on site? Because they're still not reaching that much of anybody on traditional television. Yes, you can watch it online, but that's still the missing piece for me, Zach. I'm not sure if the indirect affiliation with the PGA Tour makes it easier for them to get some sort of a newer deal, if it's even possible for them to get out of the CW deal in 2024, because that's the missing piece for me. I still feel like LIV needs that PGA Tour affiliation to make more inroads. But ironically, if there is a true partnership, the PGA Tour may say LIV's not worth the trouble, and they may try to liquidate the whole thing and maybe just steal an idea here or there. So that's the way I see it. How are you seeing it from the outside? What's your perspective on where LIV could go to differentiate itself in year 3?
I mean, there's definitely a catch-22 going on here. I think what could help them might ultimately end them, and what hurts them just leaves them in no man's land, and that's what they're facing. I think maybe you sacrifice that Midwest and Northeast that you mentioned. I think the biggest critique of one of them from the PGA Tour is that it's too Americanized, and there's just too many TPC courses. So I think this is LIV's answer to that, is maybe they understand the PGA Tour has maybe a better handle on markets. Maybe the return wasn't as good from a fan perspective for some of these repeat stops, and maybe they're just trying to entice different golfers to say, hey, if you come, we'll play in your home country, and we'll try to get your fans out there, and you can sleep in your own bed, see your family. And there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, they followed through with having an event in Australia, which was huge for guys like Cam Smith, guys like Mark Leishman. I mean, they're doing a lot of these good things. You have a lot of having an event in South Korea would be huge. Obviously, you have a lot of players that are from South Korea and neighboring countries, so that would be very significant. I think that they're stuck in a lot of ways. I think even a guy like Bryson DeChambeau, could he have been a captain's pick? I think if the U.S. wasn't so ignorant, and it would have been all out Cold War stuff. We would have been talking Khrushchev stuff if Brooks Koepka was not a captain's pick because of what guys were able to do when he wasn't able to accumulate points during that FedEx Cup playoff run. But ultimately, they did choose Koepka, which was the right decision. And I think Koepka brought some flair by saying he was one of the few guys that really enjoyed having a pressure putt. And I thought that was very telling, but it was also very on brand. And in a sense, you could look at it as a put down of LIV, but really it wasn't. I think in a sense, he was kind of standing up for his guys in his own maybe indirect way. And he even said a couple guys maybe were worth getting calls, which obviously was a nod to DeChambeau, which obviously was a nod to Dustin Johnson. I mean, even Taylor Gooch was really displaying some good form earlier on in the season, and Patrick Reed's notorious for bringing it during the Ryder Cup. So there's definitely some notable omissions that were there, and obviously you saw Koepka and DeChambeau paired together, and obviously there's nothing amiss there. It was just a straightforward round, so that was obviously good to see. It's compelling stuff to watch, but it's not everybody's cup of tea, and everybody's still not able to necessarily watch it. And that's where I think the PGA Tour and the rights that you mentioned would be very integral. But at that point, is LIV canceled, like you said? So it's a delicate position. And it was even interesting that Bryson DeChambeau felt like an apologetic winner when he won, because he kind of made Anirban Lahiri bridesmaid once again. I mean, Lahiri's been really coming on here in year two after learning things from year one, and the chances was certainly there. So it was good to see DeChambeau be humble. It's good to see DeChambeau be a little bit more mellow, because I think a lot of times he comes across a little bit too high strung for some golf fans. Personality, brand, just identity. There's a lot there for a lot of people. So it's good to see DeChambeau maturing a little bit more as he gets older and being more of a rounded golfer. So it was good for him. I'm glad that you were able to get out there and just be able to be on the ground once again and just get a chance to experience LIV. There's a lot to like about the tour. Obviously, people just don't even consider it in some respects for some off the course situations, and obviously some of those lawsuits that were being filed have ended unsuccessfully for defamation as well, Patrick Reed. But otherwise, I mean, it's been an interesting product to see, and I think they've taken some of the feedback from year one and been better in year two. But the honeymoon phase is over, Matt, and it seems like a lot of people are golfed out in these markets, and they're going to have to come up with a strategy. And they still don't even know if after year three they're going to be in operation anymore. So there's a lot of things really to consider.
Barring a change to the television situation, to the video streaming situation, I guess, put it that way, in this modern age. I think the biggest answer for LIV is just get more high-profile players. So perhaps what we saw at the Ryder Cup, if there was some sort of a fracture between guys who are disgruntled or guys who aren't. At any rate, there is the chance that we do see more movement this offseason, 2023 into 2024. All right, Zach, I'm going to hand this segment over to you, basically, because you know a heck of a lot more about the Korn Ferry Tour playoffs than I do, just on merit of covering it live in Columbus at the Scarlet Course on the campus of Ohio State University. You were out there last weekend for us at Pittsburgh Golf Now as, well, the Korn Ferry returns to Central Ohio, but not as a regular season event, as a playoff event. And, well, that's what continues to make golf one of the more compelling watches for me in pro sports is you get players who maybe the previous year were part-time professional golfers. Maybe they were just playing golf on the side while they were working some other gig. And then you run into a run of hot form, you put in the work and it's rewarded. And suddenly you can find yourself as a full-fledged pro golfer and maybe even a PGA Tour golfer with a limited access to tournaments, or even a full-fledged PGA Tour member through the Korn Ferry Tour. So what did you see on site there? I know you ran into a couple of former Nicholas Award winners, of course, appropriate. They're back in Columbus, the home of Jack's tournament, the Memorial. But also you saw some names that were connected to at least one prominent Pittsburgh amateur golfer as well. So what were some of your favorite stories from on site there at the Scarlet Course?
Well, selfishly, the best was when I holed out from the bunker on number one at the Scarlet Course the month before that.
Media day, yeah.
So quick little diatribe. It's this big bunker that's the lip is taller than I am, 5'7" on a good day. I couldn't even see where the heavens I was aiming towards. So it was one of those hit and hopes. And you've seen my bunker game. I can't get the ball out of the air in the bunker, but I knew because I was on such an upslope that it would come out hot. It would come out high and hot. So all of a sudden, my playing partners, including our very own Chris Pohl, started causing commotion. And all of a sudden, I just hear them lose their minds. And I go, what happened? And it felt like Norm from Cheers. It was like, everybody knows your name. It was the shot. I hit the shot of my life. I hole out from the bunker for a great score, and I didn't even see it. So it also, as much of a humble brag as the story it is, it also just speaks to how difficult the course is. And the Korn Ferry Tour players were consistently mentioning that so many of these courses are just low score. You shoot 4 or 5 under on any other course, and you're losing ground. You're missing cuts. And when guys are doing that, like Norman Jong was able to do, a Nicholas Award winner, Colin Phillips was able to do, and secure his PGA Tour card, among others. It's competitive. It's very interesting because everybody on that tour has a story, and gone are the days where the guys that aren't in the top 125 are playing there. So it's competitive because it's guys that that finish in the top 30 that don't necessarily have their cards, and they're still fighting and clawing for every inch. And of course, that's going to give nothing away to you. So it's very interesting to have that and to have things open. guys that truly appreciate the media coverage that are just absolutely yes. Guys like Chris Goderup, who was the last year's Nicholas Award winner, that has had a lot of hype attached to his name, that are fighting for his card, and just not necessarily a man of many words, but he's a guy that understands what it takes, and he's a guy that's in a prime position to potentially earn that card after a good play this coming week here. So it was good to cover for the first time. I've been on the Scarlet, played the Scarlet a couple of times, but to see how tough the course is, the 18th hole, that I really like the decision they made to make it a drivable course, a drivable hole in particular, where a lot of guys are just missing the fairway out of play, but they could still get birdie and chase it in and try to chase a score down. And that kind of stuff is always fun if you're a fan to watch, whether it's on TV or in person. And the galleries all that came in were able to make charitable donations, and it was free admission to come in. And everybody loves the word free, so I mean, it's just good to watch some golf and to do it on a course that is accessible. I mean, Ohio State Scarlet course is a course that is very inviting but very difficult at the same time. It's a Columbus course. I know, obviously, you have Scioto that jumps off the page. They're hosting another U.S. Senior Open in a couple of years. The USGA just announced, and of course, legendary Muirfield Village is hosting the Memorial every year. You have Inverness, which just hosted the Solheim Cup. Obviously, you have an LPGA Tour stop in Toledo as well, which we were fortunate to cover during the pandemic. So Ohio really does have a lot of interesting courses and a lot of charm and a lot of different personalities. And I think the Nicholas Award story is apt because, of course, you have guys that previously won the award, but a guy like Norman Zhang, who unfortunately doesn't talk until after golf tournaments, just his superstition. But he's a guy that won a Nicholas Award that wins this event on a course that Nicholas redesigned. So it's just interesting to see those parallels and to see those two names once again forever linked. And if Norman Zhang can make a run on the PGA Tour, then that's almost a story that Jack Nicklaus has always been a part of his life. John Vanderland, same thing. Won the Nicholas Award the same year Norman Zhang did. Beat him at Scioto to get a Barbasol PGA Tour exemption for that tournament. And that's a story that you can tell. Of course, Vanderland did not beat Zhang that week, and he's going to be a chaser for a Tour Card. But it's interesting to see all these guys in the hunt that have Jack Nicklaus in their name and have had that handshake and had that conversation, have those autographed trophies. And for a guy that we mentioned also, a guy that had U.S. amateur experience at Oakmont Country Club, it's been interesting to see where his career's taken him. Obviously very undersized, obviously has a great story going to Notre Dame. Of course, Palmer Jackson, the local product, the Central Catholic product that was able to, of course, be able to play together. And those two still are very much together and in touch. And for him to go low was just an amazing experience. So it was good on David Chatfield, to have a good week and possibly maybe backdoor his way into the PGA Tour, but either way, just continue his golf journey. These guys that don't make the PGA Tour still have a home on the Korn Ferry Tour, and tomorrow is still promised to chase their dreams. And that's why it's so compelling. It's so interesting to watch these guys work and literally fight for everything. And that's what makes the Korn Ferry so interesting. It's such a humble beginning, and there's a lot to be said for it.
Well, hey, if Xander Schauffele goes to LIV, the PGA Tour would need a new X-Man. Maybe it's Norman Zhang, spelled Xiong. I've been plotting that for 3 minutes since you brought him up, or maybe 5 minutes. So gotta let me let loose there at the end. On our fourth shot, PGA.
We just lost viewers, Matt.
Well, whatever one person was watching, they're gone. So it's just us now. You can say whatever you like. Anyway, Zach, always good to catch up with you. Thanks for making time for us, and thank you for making the drive out to Columbus. As with me being on the ground, it's just you learn a lot when you're actually there. So we'll continue to endeavor to carve some time out of our busy schedules to cover some live golf for you, regardless of where it is or which tour it might be on. All right, remember to follow Pittsburgh Golf Now on social media at PGH Golf Now. Speaking of X, it's X and Twitter, whatever you want to call it. We're still on there, and we're still obviously very active at the website, PittsburghGolfNow.com. Zach, thank you. And bad jokes aside, always a pleasure to connect.
Absolutely, and very quickly, a shout out as well to Colston Cooper, who made the trip and did a lot of the transcribing for myself as well. So thank you to Colston as well. I almost missed that, so I just wanted to make sure I gave Colston his just desserts as well.
traveling transcriptor. That's awesome. That's just as good as ASAP Sports as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for your contribution. All right, for Zach, I'm Matt. Talk to you next time on the PGN Par 4.